The morning had that particular London gray to it. Not storm gray, not fog gray, but the kind of pale nothing sky that makes everything look slightly overexposed, like an old photograph someone left near a window too long. I was standing outside the east service gate of Windsor Castle, waiting for my colleague Marcus to show up with the credentials I'd forgotten at the hotel. Just standing there. 40 minutes of nothing to do but watch. That's how I saw it. The thing about Royal Service staff, palace guards, housekeeping, the quiet men in dark suits who walk slightly behind important people, is that they have a specific way of moving. Controlled. Each footstep like a word chosen carefully before being spoken. You learn to read that language if you spend enough time around them, and I'd spent 3 years covering royal-adjacent events for a mid-sized media outlet that mostly ran stories nobody cared about until suddenly everyone did. Senior Household Protection Officer James Alcott moved differently that morning. I didn't know his name then. I learned it later. But I noticed him the way you notice a crack in a wall you've walked past 100 times. Something shifted in the geometry of it, and your brain flags it before your eyes fully register why. He walked out of the vehicle security area, the covered bay where staff cars are swept before anyone with a title gets within 20 feet of them, and he stopped. Just stopped. Stood there in the thin morning light with a file folder pressed flat against his chest like he was trying to keep it from escaping his body. His face was doing nothing. That's what got me. Not worry, not shock, nothing. The kind of nothing a person produces when something has happened that is so far outside their prepared emotional responses that the whole system just goes quiet. Reboots. Sits there on a blank screen. He stood like that for maybe 15 seconds. Then he took a breath so controlled it looked like a practice technique, turned, and walked back inside. Here's what I knew, and what I didn't. What I knew. Camilla, the Queen Consort, had a vehicle inspection scheduled that morning as part of a routine security rotation. These happen periodically when the threat assessment for senior royals gets updated. Not always publicly announced, not always notable. Staff cars, accompanying vehicles, secondary transport. Standard. Why I didn't know. Would have been found inside one of those vehicles. That part came later. That part came through a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear between two household staff members who were talking in a corridor adjacent to where I was waiting, and who clearly assumed I was either deaf or irrelevant. I was neither. The words I caught, in pieces strung together like beads on a broken necklace. Not supposed to be there. 3 of them, at least. No record of authorization. Alcott took it straight upstairs. 3 things. Unauthorized. In the Queen Consort's vehicle. Taken directly to senior levels without going through the standard documentation process first. I wrote nothing down. My phone stayed in my pocket. I stood very still, and I listened to my own heartbeat do something complicated. The second thing that happened that morning was easier to see and harder to understand. At 11:42, I checked my phone because I was bored, and then I was very glad I had. A black Range Rover pulled into the courtyard. Not Camilla's detail. The plates were different. The accompanying vehicles were different. The 2 men who stepped out and held the door with the particular practiced ease of people who have held a lot of doors for someone important. Prince William walked in like he had somewhere to be 10 minutes ago. Now, I want to be careful here, because what I'm about to describe is easy to overread. Bodies do things in the presence of tension that don't always mean what you think they mean. Jaw tension can be a headache. A fast walk can be a tight schedule. I know this. I'm careful about this. I've been burned before by projecting a narrative onto a man who was simply cold and late for lunch. But his protective detail, the 2 men who usually move in a quiet triangle around him, present but invisible, were watching him instead of watching the perimeter. That's the tell. When a protection officer's eyes track inward instead of outward, it means the thing they're calculating has changed. The external threat assessment dropped down the priority list. Something internal got elevated. William moved through the entrance without acknowledging the 2 members of household staff who offered the standard greeting. Not dismissive, not rude, just elsewhere. His attention was somewhere in his own head that didn't have windows. One of the staff members, a woman I'd seen before, worked the interior hospitality area, watched him pass, and then looked at the floor. Not deferentially, with the specific quality of someone who knows something and is relieved not to have been asked about it. I got Marcus's call at noon. He had the credentials. He was also 20 minutes away because he got on the wrong train, which was very Marcus, and I stood there with 40 more minutes of nothing to do but watch a castle breathe. By 12:15, there were more people in the East Courtyard than there should have been for a Tuesday in March. Not crowds. Palace staff don't cluster. They're trained against it. It signals disruption to anyone watching, and someone is always watching. But there were arrivals. Small, sequential, each one apparently routine, and each one adding to a density of senior personnel that wasn't quite right for the time of day. A private secretary, 2 people from the household communications office, a legal advisor I recognized from a briefing I'd attended 2 years prior, who definitely did not work on the Windsor estate as a regular matter. The legal advisor was the data point that changed the temperature of the whole morning for me. You don't call in legal for a routine vehicle inspection. You don't call in legal for a misunderstanding. You call in legal when someone needs to understand precisely where the lines are drawn and who drew them and what happens when those lines get crossed. The last thing I saw that morning before Marcus finally arrived with my credentials, and I had to stop being a statue and start being a journalist. Officer Alcott came back out through the East Service entrance. He was alone. The file folder was gone from his chest, replaced by nothing. His hands were empty, hanging at his sides with the specific weightlessness of a man who has handed over the thing he was carrying and is now waiting to find out what happens next. He stood at the edge of the courtyard. He looked, for just a moment, like a man who had pulled a thread on a sweater and is only now realizing how far the unraveling is going to go. Then he clasped his hands behind his back, parade rest, instinct, years of training asserting themselves, and he waited. I thought about that image for a long time afterward. The castle behind him, the pale sky overhead, the file already upstairs, already in someone's hands, already beginning to mean something official. And this one man standing in the cold, hand behind his back, with the particular stillness of someone who did their job exactly right, and is no longer sure that was the correct decision. By 2 in the afternoon, the story had grown a spine. Marcus arrived, I got my credentials, and we did the thing we come to Windsor to do, a prearranged media access window for a charity initiative, photographed handshakes, a statement read aloud by someone junior, the ordinary machinery of royal public relations grinding through its ordinary Tuesday. I took notes. Marcus shot footage. Neither of us said anything about the morning. We had nothing confirmed. We had atmosphere and geometry and a legal advisor who wasn't supposed to be there. That's not a story. That's a feeling. But feelings have a way of acquiring bones. The source reached out at 4:47. I'm not going to describe them in any way that matters. Not their position, not their department, not the specific phrasing of the message they sent, because all of those details narrow a field, and I made a promise that fields would not be narrowed. What I can tell you is that they had been at Windsor that morning. They had been in rooms I hadn't been in, and they were not sleeping well. The message was short. 3 sentences. The inspection flagged documents. Not security, personal. Alcott followed protocol, and it went to William directly because of what the documents pertain to. I read it 4 times. Then I read it a 5th time, slower, paying attention to what wasn't there. It didn't say whose documents. It didn't say what they pertained to beyond the word personal. It didn't say what Alcott's protocol dictated in such a case, or why that protocol skipped the usual chain and went straight to Prince William rather than to the King's office, or to the private secretary's desk, or to any of the dozen administrative layers that exist between a vehicle inspection finding and a senior royal's direct awareness. It went to William. Why William? That was the bone. I want to explain something about the way information moves inside royal households, because most people have no real model for it, and the one they've assembled from films and tabloids is almost entirely wrong. It isn't hierarchical in the way an organization chart would suggest. It isn't a pyramid where the king sits at the top and everything filters up. It's more like a series of concentric loyalty circles, each one with its own gravitational center, and the circles don't always align. The king's household. The Queen Consort's household. The Prince of Wales's office. They share space and protocol and the same postcode, but they're not the same entity. They are in some configurations competing entities. When something is found in a vehicle belonging to Camilla's detail, and then that finding travels not to her household, not to the king's office, but directly to William's people, that isn't standard procedure. That's a choice. Someone made a judgment about who needed to know this first and who could learn about it second, or third, or in a meeting they hadn't requested and weren't prepared for. That choice has a meaning. That meaning was what I spent the next 4 hours trying to understand. My second message from the source came at 7:12, after I'd eaten a sandwich I barely tasted and made 3 calls that produced nothing except the particular frustration of people who clearly knew something and were absolutely not going to say it. The documents involved a third party, not family, not staff, someone with no business being in that vehicle or in correspondence with that office. William saw them before anyone else. He requested a meeting with Camilla for tomorrow morning. A third party, no business being in that vehicle. I set my phone face down on the desk and sat very still for a moment. Here's the thing about third parties in royal contexts. They're never neutral. There is no such thing as an accidental connection at that level. No paperwork that finds its way into a queen consort's vehicle through oversight or carelessness. Every document in proximity to a senior royal is there intentionally. Every name is there on purpose. A third party with no business being there meant one of two things. Someone was operating outside sanctioned channels, or someone was operating inside channels that weren't supposed to be visible. Neither of those is a small thing. Both of those require the kind of meeting that gets scheduled for early morning, when the household is still settling into its routines, when conversations can happen in rooms that haven't yet filled with the day's ordinary witnesses. William had requested that meeting for the next morning, which meant by the time I woke up the following day, whatever was going to happen had already begun happening. I didn't sleep much. Not because I was excited. I want to be precise about this because there's a version of this kind of story that is about the thrill of proximity to power and the crackle of a developing revelation. And that version is a story told by someone who forgot that real people are attached to real consequences. I wasn't thrilled. I was uncomfortable in the specific way you get uncomfortable when you realize you're standing at the edge of something that was already in motion long before you arrived, something that involves grief and history and loyalty so old and complicated that no outsider can fully map them. William and Camilla. I thought about that for a long time in the dark. The years between them. The years before. The specific texture of what was asked of him as a child, as a young man, as a son, and the specific texture of what he had found a way publicly, visibly to accommodate. A détente. Not warm, perhaps, but functional. Professional. The kind of peace that gets built in the ruins of something harder, brick by careful brick. And now a file folder. And now a legal advisor on a Tuesday. And now a meeting requested for 7 a.m. I was back at Windsor by 6:30. The morning was colder than the day before. A real cold. The kind that gets into the space between your collar and your neck and stays there. The sky was the color of old pewter. 2 crows were doing something aggressive and complicated on the roof of the east wing, and the sound of it carried further than it should have in the quiet. The courtyard was empty. That was the first thing I noticed. For 6:30 on a Wednesday, with a full household roster and a schedule I'd been briefed on that included 3 morning engagements, the courtyard should have had movement in it. Staff arrivals, vehicle prep, the quiet choreography of a day being assembled. Nothing. Not even the crows for a moment. Just the cold and the pewter sky and one journalist standing by a gate with a coffee that had stopped being warm 20 minutes ago, waiting for something she couldn't name to happen in a building she couldn't enter. At 6:53, the lights in a first-floor room on the north side of the main building came on. I know the rough layout of that floor. Not well, I'm not an architectural historian, and I hadn't done specific research on this, but well enough to know that the north-facing first-floor rooms are not the public-facing staterooms, not the ceremonial spaces. They're working rooms, meeting rooms, The kind of spaces that exist in grand buildings to give the occupants somewhere to be difficult and private. The light stayed on. At 7:04, a second light. Adjacent room. At 7:11, I heard, or thought I heard, and I've questioned myself about this enough times that I'm going to give you the honest version rather than the confident version. I thought I heard a voice raised briefly. Not words, pitch and duration. The register of someone making a point that they were not making gently. Then nothing. Then the crows came back. I stood there with my cold coffee and my cold hands and the growing understanding that whatever was happening in those lit rooms was not mine to witness. That I was at this moment standing outside the frame of something genuinely private. Not in the tabloid sense of privacy, not the privacy of a celebrity who'd prefer not to be photographed, but something older than that, more serious. A family, a wound, a set of people trying to figure out what loyalty means when loyalty pulls in 4 different directions at once. I thought about Alcott, hands behind his back, file already upstairs. He had done his job exactly right. And now in a lit room on the north side of the building, the thing that job had put in motion was happening without him. Without any of us, T751, Camilla left. Not through the main entrance. Not through the public-facing south gate, where vehicles line up in the correct formation, and everything is choreographed for the cameras that are always somewhere positioned. She left through the east service exit, the same one Alcott had used the day before, in a vehicle that was already running when it pulled up, which means it had been staged in advance, which means someone had planned for a departure that needed to be quiet. I saw the vehicle leave. I did not see her face. I saw the shape of her through tinted glass, a silhouette, still and upright, the way people sit when they're performing composure for themselves rather than for an audience. When you're not trying to look calm for anyone watching. When you just need to hold your own spine together for the duration of a car ride. The vehicle turned left out of the service exit. It didn't slow. It didn't hesitate at the junction the way cars sometimes do when the passenger inside is undecided about something. It turned with the particular clean precision of a destination already known, already accepted, already committed to. She was gone in under 30 seconds. I stood there for a while after that. The cold had gotten serious. My fingers were doing that thing where they stop registering as fingers and start registering as a problem I'd have to deal with later. The crows had moved on. The courtyard was still mostly empty, but beginning, slowly, to wake up, a delivery van at the north gate, 2 household staff crossing the east lawn, a single uniformed officer taking up position at the ceremonial entrance with the particular unhurried efficiency of someone starting a long shift. The ordinary machinery of the place, resuming. That's what gets you when you cover things like this. The way ordinary life keeps running. The kettle's still boiling. The post still arriving. The rotas still being followed, and the floors still being polished, and the flag still moving in whatever wind there is. Everything enormous happens inside a structure that just continues, doesn't pause, doesn't observe a moment of silence for the gravity of what's occurring in the rooms above it. The building just keeps being a building. My third message from the source came at 8:34. I was in a coffee shop by then, thawing my hands on a ceramic mug. Marcus across the table from me, eating a full English breakfast with the focused dedication of a man who had slept well and was not thinking about unlit rooms and legal advisors and silhouettes and moving vehicles. The message was longer than the first 2. I'm going to paraphrase it rather than quote it, not because the specific wording was sensitive, though it was, but because the specific wording was also the most human version of events I received, and putting it in quotation marks would flatten it into data. And it wasn't data. It was a person trying to explain something complicated with the vocabulary available to them at 8:30 in the morning after a sleepless night. What they told me. The documents found in the vehicle were correspondence. Not official correspondence. Not the kind that goes through private secretaries and gets logged and filed in the household records the way official communications do. Personal. The kind written between individuals who consider themselves to have a direct relationship that didn't require institutional mediation. The third party was someone with a professional proximity to the royal household. Not staff in the formal sense. Not family. The category the source used was adjacent, which is a word that does a lot of work without saying very much, and I understood why they chose it. The correspondence indicated a level of access, informational access, not physical, that had not been formally sanctioned. Not through William's office, not through the king's office. The information referenced had come from somewhere, reached someone it shouldn't have reached, and was now documented in writing that had been sitting in a vehicle waiting to be swept. William had seen the documents, and then he had requested the meeting. Here's what I think happened in that room, and I want to be clear that this is interpretation, not record. I have no source for the interior of that meeting. I have the shape of its edges, who entered, who left, when, how. And from those edges, I am constructing a center the way you reconstruct a broken plate from the shards. You can get close. You can't be certain. I think William came to that meeting having already processed his anger. That sounds like a small thing, but it isn't. The William the first have observed across years of proximity. Not close proximity, not personal familiarity, the proximity of a person who watches professionally, does not arrive at confrontations in heat. The opposite. He gets very still before he gets very direct. The anger, when it exists, has already been folded into something more precise, more controlled, deployed rather than expressed. I think he came with the documents organized. I think he used language that was considered and specific, the kind of language that doesn't raise its voice because it doesn't need to, because the words themselves are loud enough. And I think Camilla, who is whatever else you might say, a woman who has navigated more hostile rooms than most people will ever stand in, understood immediately what kind of conversation she was in. Not a conversation she could manage. Not one she could redirect or soften with the particular social fluency she has developed across decades of necessity. A conversation with an endpoint already decided. The question of what that endpoint was, what was asked, what was agreed to, what was said in the final minutes before she walked out to that waiting car. That I don't know. That's the room I couldn't enter. That will remain the room I couldn't enter. Marcus put his fork down at some point while I was sitting with my phone and my coffee and the message still on my screen, and he said, "How big is it?" He's been doing this long enough to read the specific quality of my silence. I said I didn't know yet. He said, "Big enough that you can't sleep." I didn't answer that one. By mid-morning, the Household Communications Office had issued a brief schedule amendment for the day. Camilla's afternoon engagement at a Children's Arts Foundation was being attended by a representative of her office rather than in person. The reason given was a scheduling conflict. The statement was 4 sentences long, entirely unremarkable, written in the specific beige non-language that means everything and nothing and is designed to pass through the news cycle like water through fingers. 3 journalists I knew filed brief items. Minor. Nothing. No one had what I had, and what I had was still, all shape and no center. I found Officer Alcott at noon. Not deliberately, or not entirely deliberately. I had reasons to be in the area of the service compound where I found him, reasons that were legitimate, if not specifically the reason I was there. He was standing by a vehicle bay entrance, drinking tea from a thermos lid, looking at nothing in particular with the particular 1,000-yard emptiness of a man who has been thinking the same thought in a loop for 36 hours, and the thought has not gotten smaller with repetition. I didn't approach him directly. I stood nearby and let the silence sit for long enough that declining to acknowledge it became more deliberate than acknowledging it. He looked at me. I said something that wasn't exactly a question, more of an observation. About the morning before. About the nature of routine inspections that don't stay routine. He was quiet for long enough that I thought I'd miscalculated. Then he said, "You do the job in front of you." That was all. He recapped his thermos, tucked it under his arm, and walked back into the compound. "You do the job in front of you." I wrote it down. Not because it was a quote I could use. It was nothing. It was 7 words that could mean anything. I wrote it down because it felt like the thesis of the whole 2 days. The organizing principle that everything else had been orbiting without my quite seeing it. Alcott did the job in front of him. He found something. He followed protocol. He put the file in the right hands without deciding what those hands should do with it. That's all. That's the whole of his role. He didn't engineer the consequences. He didn't manage the fallout. He handed it upstairs and went back to standing in the cold. The job in front of him. William did the job in front of him too, in whatever way he defines that job, with whatever weight of history and hurt and responsibility he carries around the specific question of what loyalty and family and truth require of him. He saw the documents. He requested the meeting. He said what he said in that room. The job in front of him. And Camilla, in the back of that clean, swift-turning car, spine held rigid, composure performed for no audience. She was doing whatever comes next. The job in front of her. Whatever shape that takes when the door of a difficult room closes behind you, and the road ahead is already chosen. I filed nothing. Not that day. Not the next. I sat with what I had, and I thought about the weight of it, and the gap between what I knew and what I could verify and what I could defend in print, and I thought about Alcott's face in that first moment, the blank screen, the rebooting system, and I thought about the woman in the moving car. There are stories you carry for a long time before they become stories. This was one of those. Well, I can tell you, what I'm telling you now, from the distance of enough time that the people involved have made their own decisions about what's visible and what isn't, is this: something was found. Someone did the right thing with it. And in a first-floor room with the lights on at 7 in the morning, in a building that has held harder conversations than this one and will hold harder ones still, two people sat across from each other with the weight of something uncomfortable between them. The building kept being a building. The crows came back. The flags moved in whatever wind there was. The last thing I wrote in my note from those 2 days was not something I observed. It was something I thought, standing outside Windsor in the pewter morning while a car I couldn't see and it turned left out of Service Gate and drove away. The Crown doesn't ask if you're ready. It just puts the next thing in front of you and watches to see what you do with it. And what you do with it, the choice you make in the cold with the file in your hands or the room behind you or the road ahead, that's the only answer that counts. That's the only answer that ever counted.